ravaged, decaying open world, magic-fueled adventures are partly original gaming material, and in that sense, Atlas Fallen is certainly not treading new ground, but this story-focused single-player and fully playable online co-op title is at least trying to offer more bang and choice for your buck. Built on the German studio Deck 13's own in-house Fledge engine, it looks good, at least from a last generation perspective, but 3 years into the current gen and being confined to PS5, Series X, Series S and PC, it does not make the strongest first impression from a technical and visual front, but things do improve. But let's start with some big positives for the game and the team here. They first rose to fame with their Dark Souls-alike Lords of the Fallen in 2014, a technically impressive, if not groundbreaking title, and that followed up with a further showcase of the same Fledge engine in The Surge and its 2019 sequel. This evolution has brought them a good basis of last generation releases that was solid from such a relatively small team of approximately 100 employees. With Atlas Fallen, the team has taken that last generation base and used it to push the resolution, performance and open world aspects, which is very popular now within the PS5 and Series X, having dual modes of performance and quality. Unsurprisingly, the Series S makes do with a single mode. Now that resembles the performance mode on the bigger consoles. The engine does support FSR2 reconstruction and dynamic resolution scaling, but on consoles this was disabled before launch, and even after 2 updates it still appears to be inactive on all 3, with PC also highlighting integration issues with that AMD solution on Steam Deck. I believe this is still a work in progress, and even if you can get it enabled in the menu, it likely does not work at all, or at least very well, with minimal performance gains seen on my Steam Deck testing here, with approximately 20% seen here at 900p. If the scaler is allowed to drop down to 720p levels, we should be able to see around 50% based on pixel counts, which means it's likely not scaling aggressively enough.
But it will not last long.
Now the game could and indeed should be using a DRS solution on consoles, but from my tested sections, the counts appear fully static on each, and we'll get to the reasons why in performance. With the single mode on the S coming in at 1080p, the Series X and PlayStation 5 boost this to 1440p in their respective performance modes, with all 3 targeting 60 FPS as a frame rate output. And then if IQ is your aim, the quality mode, exclusive to Series X and PlayStation 5, bumps this up to a full 3840 by 2160. And all 3 use the game's inbuilt TAA to clean it up as best they can. The cost for this hike in pixels is now a cutback to 30 FPS ceiling on performance, which is another highlight of the game. Taking the performance mode on PS5 and Series X, they barely drop a stitch throughout my tests. Fast travel, combat, cutscenes across the opening couple of hours, I saw 2 frame drops in 33 milliseconds for the PS5 and 5 in total for the Series X in this mode. And that was over 20 minutes in each combat exploration. You do get some mild streaming loading stutter when cutscenes start or entering a new area, but these are brief and very infrequent. From a playability perspective, this is the mode to choose, and the rock solid rates, at least from my tests anyway, do see it not buckle at all throughout play. Also, on occasion, the game interleaves world or camera updates with alpha and particles, which can create a stutter or hitching impression in movement, but as the game is still actually updating the screen, it's not a dropped frame, but actually dropped locomotion, which can feel the same to the player, but our framerate tool correctly picks this up as interleave frames and new. In the big battles, with extensive use of the impressive particle system the engine has, likely GPU created, we can see some minor dips under that 60 FPS level, but they're single frames and fleeting when they do on Series X, and likely can happen on PS5 as well. Next up is that single Series S mode, which also manages a largely solid level of performance at that 60 FPS target. It's not quite as solid, with some cutbacks in the visual department. Arguably the biggest is that 1080p resolution, but the extra fluidity that this offers is the better choice over the IQ. And for this game it's needed, as even in the 60 FPS mode, input response is not that high. The performance, although solid in all, it can drop a few more frames in combat and exploration over the other two consoles, and finally some bandwidth and fill rate heavy explosions in combat and cutscenes can cause all three to drop into that next 33 millisecond frame time. But unsurprisingly, Series S is most affected when this happens, with the worst points being in the mid-40s, although they are brief. The main thing is the next 16 milliseconds refresh is used when it does need to drop frames, staying between 16 and 33 milliseconds even in worst case tested scenarios.
Just warn me next time. I thought I was going to die.
Sorry. My mind is...
Wow, this is... Wow!
Please stay focused.
Now, the quality mode does improve image quality with a welcome boost, but the leap is not as big as the cost of 30 FPS, although it is, as you would expect, rock solid here on both consoles. The loss of fluidity feels very jarring though, and this is largely due to the high input latency just mentioned. Now, in the performance mode, we see a median input time of 106.8 milliseconds, which is high for a 60 FPS title. It can certainly dip below 100 milliseconds at times, but overall, that's what you get from camera movement and control. But in the quality mode, this feels terrible, with input being much slower and compounded by some delayed button responses at times, which can happen in the menus, also pointing to issues within the game engine itself. As a medium, we now see another 66 milliseconds on top of that, of 173.5, and as such, this mode comes in with too large of an impact for me to recommend. The changes here from performance seem to only be resolution based, with shadows, level of detail, ambient occlusion, and general pop-in being the same, and it can be quite jarring in both modes, with objects, grass, decals, and other areas of the screen drawing in and popping in as you walk or slide through the world. Shadow map cascade can also be noticed in the 30 FPS mode, as it stands out more due to the sharper image, and the Series S is impacted most here though, with both shadow maps and level of detail appearing to be the PC equal of low and medium respectively, and this is quite obvious. That said, even the high settings that PlayStation 5 and Series X can use still have an obvious amount of pop-in, and shadows are not a huge leap up, appearing to use the high setting on PC but are close enough to medium to flip-flop between, but they look closest to high when you're out in the open world. Neither resolve the issue specifically, and shadows stand out often with very low resolution and an unstable quality, something true of all previous games from Lords of the Fallen and The Surge. Even the very high settings on PC, although better, are still not resolved with this, and pop-in and shadow acne is prominent at times across all formats no matter the settings. In terms of visual quality and settings, Series X and PlayStation 5 are identical from all my checks in both modes and each other, and this is the closest to the highest settings on PC in most areas, with textures at very high, shadows and ambient occlusion likely at high. As you can see with my on-screen comparisons, they almost match up exactly to the high setting of ambient occlusion. Shadows a little bit harder to pick out at certain points. Series S has textures closest to high, and some of that may be the 1080p ceiling, and then it has low shadows and what looks to be closest to medium ambient occlusion and volumetrics, and level of detail maybe low or medium, which just aids performance that little bit more. Everything else on Series X and PlayStation 5 comes closest to looking like the very high settings based on my RX 6800 machine as the higher end of PC running the maximum settings. Now, the PC settings are quite limited in the menu, and I did also have issues with it not mapping to my desktop display or resolution and FPS at times. As noted, DRS does not work on AMD cards, as does FSR2, and likely true of Nvidia cards also. As per consoles, this is likely still a work in progress and may drop for all in a later patch. Using my RX 6800 as an example, with maximum settings on all except ambient occlusion and shadows, which are set to high to match the closest I can to PS5 and Series X, we can see that 60 FPS is not possible as a locked option. Again, in those dense particle filled moments, it can dip below this as noted. And at 1440p, the exact same settings, we have sufficient headroom here to never dip below 60 FPS. And as such, it highlights that the team have likely set the resolution across all consoles at those lowest bounds of the DRS solution, could they implement it, to ensure consistent performance, the correct thing to do. But if they get that working, then I could see that 4K mode becoming the default with DRS set at 60 FPS, and it then could just scale up and down as needed. Now the same would likely be true of the Series S, with a 1440p mode that scales to 1080p more often would provide a better IQ, which is clearly much softer and reduced over the console competition. As this game is not CPU limited at 60 FPS at least on any good gaming CPU anyway, then beyond this though, and in more NPC packed towns or dense areas, it can actually become bound by a single core, even in the recommended and default Vulkan API, with it maxing out a single core of my 5600X at 4.6 GHz, close to 120 FPS. So beyond that rate on PC, a much faster single core CPU would be required. I also note that thread affinity will shift between the OS and general multi-core use is low, and certainly an area for future engine updates. In terms of the Steam Deck, then again, you need to use the Vulkan API, but at 800p with DRS enabled, which may buy you a few percent, at medium settings, you generally can cap at 30 FPS, and by and large, you will stay consistently locked at that rate. It can dip below again by all the areas I've just covered, and again, it can be impacted heavily at certain points by streaming and stuttering due to the relatively weaker CPU and single thread dependency. Although the cutbacks in visual department don't make that much of an impact, although the input latency is the real deal breaker for me, as it can feel quite sluggish on the handheld at only 30 FPS.
Sorry, my mind is blurry at best.
In regards to settings, then max to high is your best bang for buck, with a welcome 20% approximate improvement going down to high, and shadows is the lion's share of that cost. It increases filtering, resolution and shadow cascade across the world. As such, I recommend high for all PCs, and then mid-range and Steam Deck, as you see here, I recommend medium across the board, as the circa 2% from medium to low just isn't worth the impact to image quality and performance. The game's TAA at lower levels, as you see here at 720p, can cause ghosting and is generally okay, but definitely lower the sharpness to remove the fizzle on thin high frequency elements such as foliage. So wrapping up the engine side, as the game actually supports both Vulkan and DX12, it's another title, just like Baldur's Gate 3 last week, that allows us to test them in like-for-like sections. Once again, Vulkan is overall approximately 10% better performance than DX12 like-for-like. That obviously may vary and will vary depending on the scene, but the default API is Vulkan, and Steam Deck will only run with Vulkan and not DX12, and for now, I recommend Vulkan for everyone if you have issues with DX12. Finally, loading is slow on all machines, and it doesn't really make use of the SSDs and can be again CPU bound by a single thread, and is likely memory limited as well, taking upwards of around 12 seconds on average to load into a save, compounded by the game having texture map loading levels and late popping in, even going from high to low at certain points opening crates, does point to some aspects within the engine overall that need some improvement, and some of these were noted in the review guide from the team. The Deck 13 has certainly become more ambitious with each and every game, and Atlas Fallen has some promising elements within its technical and artistic makeup. The slow, dark and unimpressive start is certainly an area they should have changed, with the large and admittedly barren landscape offering up a far more pleasing and vibrant vista upon which to appreciate the quality within. The performance is solid on console and will run well on PC, and with tweaks even on the Steam Deck. The main problem is you cannot shake the fact that this is a cross-gen port without the cross-gen versions to show. It has issues within the game that stand out often enough to distract. The DRS and FSR ones, the pop-in of visual issues and bitmaps, glitchy animation, failed button responses, floaty combat, warping animations, and general input times on that 30 FPS mode, along with general wall bugs and pop-in. Was the world full and varied in content, these could be ignored in the short term, but within the first 2 hours you skate around and fight enemies that pop out of the ground like a Pokemon battle you can never escape from. In between fetch quest to fetch quest to move the story on, you can't help but feel you've been here before. As pretty and flamboyant as the FX and creatures can be, with decent sound effects, albeit with some jarring mixing and mediocre voice acting aside, nothing here grabs you for long enough. But it does at least show that building upon this with more DLC and maybe a richer, more adventurous sequel could be worthy of praise. But within its current state being good, but it's far from great.
Fetch the captain.
Yes, sir.
And here endeth another IGN performance review with Pixel's performance and everything PC and console related. Remember, if you like what we do here on IGN performance reviews, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.
That large wraith, it can call lesser ones. How annoying.